All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. It's 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar sponsored by the Section on Democracy and Social Justice of the American Society for Public Administration. This webinar is Teaching Personal and Organizational Integrity and Speaking Truth to Power. This is part 3 of our series on ethics education. This event is being recorded and will be posted and shared later on our media channels. My name is Sean and I serve as chair of the section, and I'll be remaining off camera for the duration of the event, which makes editing the video just a little bit easier. And I'm joined by Parisa Vinzant, who is DSJ Stellar Digital Engagement Coordinator. So before getting started with the webinar, I'd just like to let you know of a few upcoming DSJ events. If you're not a member of the section and would like to be kept informed of our section's events, please write to us at the email we're going to be sharing with you through the chat, and we can be sure to get you added to our contacts list. So first, what I wanted to let you know about is that our section has sponsored a series on dismantling white supremacy. And we've had 4 episodes, and we're going to be sharing our section's YouTube page so that you can see all of our past webinars. Our next webinar in this series is going to be on September 30th, and it's going to focus on public health and healthcare, and will feature these amazing panelists. Our next webinar in our ethics education series is September 22nd, and we're going to be focusing on techniques to foster ethical, engaged organizations, and will also feature these amazing panelists. Our section will offer our first book chat, and this will be on September 17th. And we're going to be talking about the book Social Equity in the Asia Pacific Region with the book's editor, Dr. Morgan Johansson of the University of Hawaii, as well as several of the chapter's authors. And finally, our section is sponsoring 2 journal special issues. The first is in Administrative Theory and Praxis and is in a companion series to our Dismantling White Supremacy series, and the lead editor is Dr. Brandy Blessett. And the second is in Public Integrity and is a companion series to our Ethics Education series, and the lead editor is Dr. Richard Gregory Johnson III. Everyone is welcome to submit a paper or proposal, and all papers are going to be going through double-blind peer review, and we're going to be sharing the call for the papers and proposals with you in the chat. So let's go ahead and get started with the event. So as seen in ASPA's Codes of Ethics, we're going to be sending you the link to that as well. Several principles of this code of ethics concern strengthening social equity, fully informing and advising, demonstrating personal and organizational integrity, and more. And we currently find ourselves in a double pandemic of COVID-19 and racism. And in an era of uncertainty, inequity, and injustice, administrators need to be able to speak truth to power in order to improve public services. They need to demonstrate integrity. Public service institutions need to be trusted. So the questions we're going to be addressing are like, how do we foster these dimensions? What can individuals and organizations do? How do we teach these elements? So we're joined by these 4 amazing panelists. We have Dr. Stephanie Dolamore of Gallaudet University, Dr. Angela Kline of Westchester University, Dr. John McCaskill of the University of Texas at Dallas, and Dr. Ashley Nichols of the Kent State University. This event lasts until 2:30 p.m. It's being recorded and will be posted later. We're going to be opening with 3 to 4 questions co-developed with our panelists, and after this, we'll open up to audience Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question, please do so in the chat. And if you'd like to ask a question over audio or video, please indicate so in the chat. So with that, I'm going to stop my screen share so we can get started with the first question. So 1 second. I'm going to be copying and pasting the question into the chat. And if the panelists would just like to go round robin about this or whatever order you want, that would be fine. So here is our first question. When examining ASPA's Codes of Ethics, we see that the 5th principle is to fully inform and advise. What do you think this principle looks like in practice, and what are ways administrators can be sure to fully inform and advise, even in situations that may make them personally and or professionally uncomfortable? And anyone wants to start, it's fine with us. John, you're on the screen. Do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, one of the things that is always an issue is trying to avoid this idea of technical rationality, right? That we get into when we decide that we want to just stay in our lane. That what these other people are doing with my skill or with my knowledge is not important to me. That I should just put blinders on and go at things any way I should. That's the way that the Holocaust got started, right? I mean, to have to have a proper genocide, you have to have public administrators there to keep the roles of who these others are that you're rounding up to do things. So I guess one of the big things is to avoid that technical rationality, but at the same time trying to avoid the royal lie and doing things to hide information or be opaque in what's going on when in actuality you're there to provide your best advice and ways of doing things to those political folks that are in power and that are trying to make these decisions. So I guess it's really kind of boils down to how you maintain a long-term perspective and stay on the right side of history in the way that you're providing this advice. And
okay, fantastic.
And I'll jump off of that if that's okay.
Yeah, please do. Please do.
So I fully agree with what John has said. And then I'd add that to me, inform and advise is an upward, right? So to elected officials, right? So how do you take the knowledge and wisdom and expertise that you have and share that in a meaningful way with elected officials? So my work tends to be grounded in local government or kind of local governance spaces. So I tend to focus on kind of that area. There's so many people in the waiting room, it's dinging at me constantly. But also I think, and I draw, from a ton of others here in thinking about our role as administrators as also informing and advising kind of a broader citizenry or a kind of a, I usually like to use the terminology of residents better, but right. So thinking about how we can share our understanding with kind of our broader constituencies in a way that is reciprocal, right? So this is my knowledge and expertise. This is how I came to claim this knowledge and expertise, but I really also want to be able to listen. And so I think for me, inform and advise is recognizing that I do come to a space with talents, skills, wisdom, but that's not the only talent, skill, or wisdom necessary. So creating, whether that's with elected officials internally or with a broader constituency, creating those spaces to share that wisdom and knowledge in a way that also honors other people's skills, talents, wisdom, all that.
I'll just continue then where Dr. Nichols left off. In terms of how we bring that into the classroom, I think that for our students, we have to start from day one fostering an environment where they're encouraged to fully advise and inform. And that's not always easy in the classroom, because if you're managing an online classroom with 30 or 40 students, how can you ensure that students are understanding the importance of doing that? And I think part of that is recognizing that you as the administrator are the instrument or the tool. And so when I think about my research methods class, we talk at length about self-reflexivity and the process of it, of really thinking of your own biases and your own privilege, and that you're going to do that throughout your career as a public administrator. And so I think the more practice that we can have with our students of the self-reflexive process and understanding that it's not a destination, that you're going to continually consider your role as the administrator and what you bring to that in terms of how you're going to communicate that with a broader constituency and then your stakeholders. So, knowing that you might be the technical expert for better or for worse, you have to consider what are your values and how are you using those values to distill that information.
I would like to continue the comments made by Dr. Kline and echo what my colleagues have shared. When I thought about this question, I thought that there are two sort of sides to this question. On one hand, there's the maybe theoretical or your intention in fully informing and advise. I think we've talked a lot about that, but then there's also that practical side of how do we go about communicating and therefore teaching our students to communicate either up or down. And for me, I thought a lot about this space that I work in, which is I work at Gallaudet University, which is a deaf community. And so I serve deaf and hard of hearing students. And I've learned a lot about what it means to communicate in a way that makes sense to the people that you're trying to communicate to. So not from my perspective, but what is going to be the most helpful or the most useful for the people that I need to communicate to. And so there's a difference, right, between translating and interpreting information, as well as maybe even communicating and developing information in a language that's somebody's first language, not their second or third language or fourth language or whatever the case may be. And so we have an obligation too, when we think about fully informing and advising, to not just fall back on the tools that we always use for communication, but what are visual ways that we can communicate? What are auditory ways that we communicate differently? What body language are we communicating in the way or not that we are presenting information to people? And so in the deaf community, this becomes very important because there's a long history of not informing and not being included in important information. And so whether you're in leadership or not, if you're in that community, there's this history there. So we spend a lot of time in my classroom talking about, the goals of communicating information to keep everyone on the same page and to have everyone be fully informed and advised. And so if I can share one quick example of like what this looks like in the deaf community, there's numerous examples of when the government needs to communicate to this community and they rely on people who are not qualified interpreters and people who are not providing information in a way that's actually accessible to the deaf community. So this often happens in emergency communication where, for example, there's a county that had to communicate information about a hurricane, and they asked a public servant who is not a certified interpreter to interpret the message to the deaf community in that area. And in doing so, he had several opportunities to speak up about what was happening because he was clearly not capable of communicating the important information. And so when he was asked to do that task, he could have spoken up, right? When he was in the middle of communicating that message, he could have been like, I'm over my head. I need to not continue. And then after the fact, he could have spoken up. And in none of those instances did he or any of the peers around him speak up. And so we have opportunities to talk about that in the classroom, about all those different opportunities to improve the way that we're communicating as an extension of our ethics and as an extension of our integrity, either personal, professional, or organizational.
Okay, excellent. So we had quite a few people join us. So what we're doing right now is we're actually just going through 3 to 4 questions for our panelists, and then we're going to open the floor to audience Q&A. We just asked our first question, and then let's get on to our second question. We can definitely follow up on any of these questions or new questions as we can. So the second question that we developed is this one. We also see in ASPIS codes that we should demonstrate personal integrity. Given we're living in a dual pandemic of COVID-19 and racism, what does demonstrating dual integrity in this time of uncertainty mean, and how can we help teach it?
So, I guess I'll start, I'll jump right in. So I think, it goes back to the old adage of what gets measured gets done. As, controversial as that statement might still be, but in terms of classroom behavior, what we're measuring or what we're giving grades and assessing is what students are going to do. It's still how the system works. So if we are incentivizing or assessing those behaviors, so personal integrity, we have to think of instruments or assessment tools for assessing that in the classroom. And so if we think back to Svara's proposition, he said that administrators have to not only be virtuous, but they have to be analytical and intuitive. And so we're good at measuring and assessing their analytical skills in the classroom. Hopefully we're all doing that for our NASPA accreditations. But in terms of their personal integrity, I think we could do a better job at assessing that in the classroom. But that's a challenging task to do because it seems as an educator to be more of a subjective journey. And so for me, I try to think of ways of incorporating that into my rubric. And that's also part of, again, thinking through the online classroom, because that's the reality that we're living in now. Discussion boards, how are they engaging with their peers? Is it a way that is respectful and courteous and shows respect for other views when they're not aligning with their own? These are just some of the ways that I'm beginning to start thinking about how to measure this in my classroom, but I'd like to hear what everyone else thinks about this.
Well, just to kind of jump in on a slightly different angle, because when I read the question, dual integrity kind of struck me as a term I wasn't sure I fully understood, and so I turned to the master of all things, Google, to see what the issue, what was meant, what was some of the surrounding and background on this. And it was interesting that I came across and much of the discussion revolved around the Anglican Church. And it was kind of fascinating because, as you may or may not know, the Anglican Church in North America decided to allow bishops to decide whether or not to ordain women to the priesthood. And about a quarter of them decided that, yeah, they were going to ordain women to the priesthood. Now, they couldn't become bishops because, come on. But you're going to lose your whole patriarchal thing if you're not careful. But but then that meant that there were a significant number of bishops that were not going to ordain women at all, and were very unhappy about that, and created this kind of a schism. And they were referring to that and the ACNA's decision to be a dual integrity denomination. And so I was like, wow, dual integrity's got all kinds of meanings wrapped in it, and the way that we've got the problems of just dealing with COVID, and then the fact that it overlayers on top of some of the social inequities that we have that are based in racism. I don't know how you can really even discuss public service without addressing these issues, because an awful lot of the ways that services are provided have this systemic level of racism that's really been interwoven through the whole way that we've evolved to deliver public services, and who's worthy of them, and all of that type of thing. And so that's as far as bringing that into the classroom, that's one of the things that I kind of start with, is this concept of social equity, and because that's where an awful lot of these things of how to approach teaching it is in my view, through this concept of social equity and social justice. What does that mean? How do we approach those things, and how do we bring these things to light that are just really, every time something tragic happens, it highlights these inequities, and people like to think, oh, well, it's all fine, and kind of have this Pollyannish approach to it, when in fact, if you look at what happened after Katrina, the neighborhoods that were absolutely devastated, the folks that were that didn't really recover from that their lives were forever changed. The same thing with the pandemic. I mean, how the virus is playing havoc on communities that have historically been subject to great deals of inequity and injustice. It just continues to highlight how and you can go into This semester I'm teaching sustainable communities, and that's another one of the issues is you can't really do that without bringing up Rawls' theory of justice and how these things work together. So, and I would fully agree with Dr. Kline about the need to bring that into your rubric of how you are assessing what you're communicating and how students are grappling with these larger issues whenever we try to look at how we're providing services.
And I guess I want to comment on from the question from an even different angle too. I think it's great that we're all sort of bringing multiple perspectives to this question. And for me, when I read the question about this dual integrity, I guess I made the assumption that it meant personal and professional integrity, and how do we balance both our desire to personally engage in ethical and behavior of integrity, as well as in our profession. And for me, the question means what happens when we're in an environment where you can no longer do that. We are sort of at a moment in history where we have to become people of integrity by being really uncomfortable. And I think that's especially true for people who are white and white allies. And so, even going so far as to like recognize who's on this panel and asking ourselves some questions about why is that becomes really important, right? So for me, one of the greatest acts that we can do to have personal and professional integrity, especially if we are white and we have white privilege, that we need to learn how to be uncomfortable and how to sit with that discomfort of our privilege being challenged and examined. And so we have to learn we have to work on learning and supporting and engaging in activities where we're going to show up for social justice, and that means being a little uncomfortable. And so for me, in my classroom, I try really hard to work on teaching my students how are we going to settle into some discomfort. And sometimes that's explicitly by bringing up topics and having discussions around, challenging aspects of the United States history or about contemporary issues that might not sit well with a variety of students in my class. And so we all have to learn how to come in and engage in that environment in a respectful and ultimately productive way. But I think explicitly, we also have ways of teaching, or implicitly have ways of teaching that to our students too, to Dr. Kline's point about, what we put into our syllabus or into our assignments. And I think one of the areas that I am learning about is our students are often programmed by these like traditional notions of teaching, right? Like that I tell them what the assignment is and then they perform the assignment and then I grade them. And so I've been working really hard in the environment that I operate to sort of question some of those notions and teach my students that we're not going to do things the way that we've always done things. Like I might not tell you how many pages an assignment needs to be. And that's really uncomfortable for some students because they want to know exactly what I need to do to perform in this classroom. And I want them to, and I will guide them through the process, but think about what they need to do. And so another tool that I've been using in my classroom is to the point that Dr. Kline made about like, how do we measure intuition, or how do we measure these elements that could be perceived as subjective from the instructor's perspective, is I place the burden of some of that back on my students. So I can grade some of what you produce in the class, but you are the only person who can grade if you've learned something. And if you feel like you're practicing and using your intuition or empathy or other skills that might be more difficult for me to assess from my perspective, because that's an internal process. And so I use practices of ungrading, or what's called self-grading, to do some of those tasks too. And again, it's uncomfortable as the instructor to like relinquish some of that power. And it's uncomfortable for our students to do that because they're like, I couldn't possibly grade myself on something. And then I say, but I might be a content expert, you're a learning expert, you know yourself. And so we can kind of work through that together. So those are some of the responses that I had to this question, but I really am appreciating the different perspectives that we're all bringing to the questions.
Excellent. So I feel really lucky that I get to go last on this question because in prepping how I wanted to respond, I was thinking about, for me, demonstrations of personal integrity and how I teach it are really grounded in social equity, much to the previous points. But a lot of that, in the way that I was thinking about it, is thinking about power and privilege, right? So this has come up in multiple ways. And then kind of layering on top of that, this concept of critical reflexivity. So I'm not just stealing all of the keywords that you all have said over the last few questions, but really they are listed right here on this page. And thinking about how do I create space for students to engage in the practice of critical reflexivity? How do I get them to think about their positionality, right? How they've benefited through social structures in some ways and maybe not in others. How when we show up to the classroom, there are already power structures at play that we have bought into and constructed along the way. And I think for me, and I'll kind of borrow a little bit from Dr. Dolamore's comments just previously, in talking about, so I practiced this last fall, and so this will be my first opportunity to practice this in a remote setting. So please bear with me. But I gave up a ton of power in my classroom, or tried to, and I said, look, I'm going to try something new. I've never been one to kind of just verbal vomit all over the screen and lecture at people. I've always tried to be in dialogue with my students, but I pulled back and let students guide conversation. And sometimes that was really hard. And sometimes they got things wrong. And and they didn't have all of the answers. And watching them work as a team of about 25 students to figure out what part of it was wrong. You know, someone made a comment about affirmative action policies, and then we spent a lot of time talking and unpacking affirmative action policy, right? And thinking about where to find the empirical evidence to kind of challenge our assumptions and kind of what we came to believe a policy did, or why it was there, or who it's harming, right? And so for me, teaching critical reflexivity also means trying to practice it a little bit and understanding my own position within the classroom, understanding how I show up, how I probably don't have all the answers, how on this webinar I probably won't have all the answers, and that I'm still working through these questions, right? Like, I prepare for this topic by studying again and reading my own, there are things that I've written, right? But reading my own things again and going back to them and thinking about whether or not I'm still in that same position, and do I still buy into those same ideas that I had 5 years ago that I do not, am I in that same place? And so I think practicing that in the classroom through actually modeling it. The other piece, in terms of kind of demonstrating personal integrity and being vulnerable and understanding one's positionality, I also think comes from giving students the opportunity to think about their identity in relationship to systems. And I had the benefit in some ways of being in a program when I was going through my MPA, where I was in a joint MSW MPA. And so the conversations around the individual within the systems were integrated into a lot of the conversations. And in other spaces I've been in, some of that is not as present. And I think that we as faculty, have a lot of power in bringing those conversations to our current and future public administrators to ask who they are as individuals within systems, and understand their power, and think about how, and challenging their own worldviews. For me, that's one of those situations where there is no right answer in terms of the assignment, but giving them the space to kind of slog through it and ask the questions. I had a student not long ago that told me they had never really thought about the fact that most people in positions of leadership of high capacity nonprofits were white men. And that foundation leadership, and thinking about the legacies of foundations and philanthropy, it was really grounded in kind of the knowledge and wisdom of white men, in the way that we teach it. I should probably caveat that. But, and giving them the space to kind of think through those, I think, was a way for me to help get them to think about personal integrity. And maybe that's disconnecting it from the kind of from personal integrity a little bit too much, but for me, that is one way that they can demonstrate their ability to kind of think through who they are in relationship to other people.
I think this is a really fantastic discussion, and this next question really builds off of it. So we've been talking a lot so far about what does it mean to fully inform and advise? What does it mean to speak truth to power? What does it mean to have personal integrity, especially given the double pandemic of COVID-19 and racism? And translating this from what people learn in the classroom, it's also these techniques about making sure that these principles are usable, actionable, informative in the workplace. And this is where this third question comes from. And I'm going to go ahead and post it in the chat here. What are actionable steps public service organizations can take to promote ethical organizations?
I'll start this one. I was really excited to see this question come out in our preparations, because I think it's all, it can be, we have a tendency to maybe stick in the classroom or stick with research. And so we always have to go back to like, where are students going, or what makes our applied field so important? And so I really like this question for thinking about at the organizational level, what needs to happen. And so for me, I got to thinking about this one important skill that I try to develop in my students, which is grounded in Showing Up for Racial Justice, Surge, their list of the characteristics of white supremacy. And so one of the characteristics of this culture that has sort of infused all of our systems is a sense of urgency, and that we have to complete and decide and make choices and then move on to the next thing, instead of maybe sitting with some of the discomfort of something being unresolved. And so I strive really hard to in my classroom to reduce and push back on the sense of urgency students might feel around even a deadline for assignments, and work has to get done and we need to move on in the classroom. But helping them understand that there is real flexibility in my classroom and in the real world. You have to learn how to ascertain what is the sense of urgency grounded in, and who's driving that. Is it a cultural value, or is there an actual deadline that needs to be reached? And so if we push back on the sense of urgency that often fills work environments, even in the public sector, we can ask questions like, is everyone in the room that needs to be here? Is everyone at the table and able to participate in this conversation? Who might be missing from this conversation that we're having, or in this episode that's occurring in front of me, or decisions that have to be made? Have we given time to really consider unintended consequences from multiple perspectives, not just who's in the room? And have we engaged in two-way conversations? So not just giving information out to stakeholders, but have we really received information to inform our decision-making process? And so I also thought about, when I read this question, about the book by Dr. O'Leary on ethics of dissent, and her work around that. She gives us some key tools for organizations if they want to develop this opportunity for dissent to happen. And we might be inclined to think that dissent means only when something's wrong. And sometimes that's true, but often dissent is just the opportunity for people to voice their perspective in a way that isn't threatening, even if they might feel that they can't do it through a normal channel. So giving multiple opportunities for that communication to happen. She says we need to create organizational culture that accepts, welcomes, and encourages candid conversation and debate. We need to listen to employees and the people we contract with. We need to understand formal and informal organizations within our workplaces. We need to separate out the individual from what the problem might be. And so recognizing people as individuals, and I think that gets to the intention people might have, and recognizing positive intention in people. We also need to create multiple channels for people to voice dissent, and then sometimes you also have to create boundaries, and then you do need to move on and continue to be productive. But so she also encourages us to have good boundaries at work too.
So I'll jump in there real quick. Apparently I really like to go after Stephanie. I'll just add that I tend to think of myself as an institutionalist, right? So I think that kind of a lot of these ethical issues are often captured in how we actually structure institutions, policies, and how those are designed, how our values and norms are kind of infused in those structures or institutions. And so for me, actionable steps for kind of thinking about how we move toward ethical organizations is very much in line with what Dr. Dolamore just talked about, and thinking about kind of how do we create organizational structures that create opportunities for dialogue and critical reflection, right? So how do we understand whose voices are at the table, and are those voices being taken seriously? In my own line of research, I have far too often seen administrators disregard the concerns of residents or citizens as unknowledgeable or misinformed, and that creates additional fissures, right? So the moment administrator refers to a resident as stupid, and it's now in the public domain, and a reporter talks about it, and everyone else just has this real discomfort and with the process and with the people that are informing the process. And so for me, I think actionable steps are at the most basic level, and I think there's a lot of other things that go into it, are creating institutional structures that offer opportunities for people to participate and be able to identify problems and identify solutions in dialogue with one another, and recognizing that people are coming at these from very different vantage points, right? So my experience is going to be different from someone else's, and how do we help facilitate that dialogue and lean into the discomfort? Because I also don't tend to think that everything is collaboration. Like, we sometimes need to be uncomfortable and understand the tensions and the problems that are at the cause, and understand the conflicts, and so in many ways having meaningful conflict management is also a really important tool for public organizations to have in order to kind of foster an ethical environment.
Thank you. I'll jump in after Dr. Nichols. The thing that makes me uncomfortable is the sense of urgency, and challenging that, because that is a cultural value of mine that I have been raised with. And so I am a product of my culture, that it's hard for me to lose that. So that's something that I am working on. And one tool that I wanted to talk about that I'm rethinking for this semester is the mid-semester evaluation that I know many of us do informally, just to collect feedback from our students, especially if you're pre-tenure. And I'm trying to think of ways that I can give some of that power back, but then also get feedback. And the sense of urgency is one that I need to address. But then to get back to the question, when we're thinking about authentic participation, again, this probably reflects my my value of urgency, but there is also a need for efficiency. And so if the thing that I've always struggled with is organizations need to have authentic participation, but at a certain point, they need to move forward with their decision. What is the interval for having authentic participation again after you have made a decision? At what point does that previous decision no longer serve the population? And so when Dr. Nichols was talking about institutions and understanding the way that we operate in institutions, it made me think of Gulick, because I'm deep in course planning for my theory class, and his alternatives for organizing bureaucracies were organization by process, clientele, place, or purpose. And so maybe we need to rethink the Gulick ideas and organize it by something else. And I don't know what that something else is, but again, if the current paradigm isn't serving us anymore, we have to propose something new. So that's what I'm thinking in terms of organizations, and of course the transparency. And that's something that I see as a challenge in the nonprofit sector. I have my students for my nonprofit management class. They have to conduct a series of nonprofit practitioner interviews and collect a series of documents to write a case report of the organization. And many semesters, I have more than one, sometimes 2 or 3 students say that the organization isn't cooperative, they won't give them information. And these are local organizations that have a strong community presence that aren't cooperating with a student. And so I wonder if the stakes were higher, you know, they definitely wouldn't be forthcoming with their information. And so, you know, coming from my perspective in the nonprofit sector, I think that that's something that needs to be addressed among nonprofits, that the transparency and the expectation of transparency needs to be increased.
Well, it's just and just to tag along with what you were just saying there. It's interesting. I have some students in my courses that are in the United Way, and the transparency that they're trying to get from organizations that they're supporting, and the just listening to the stories of the tooth pulling that's required to get some of this information, because all they're trying to do is help them. But, you know, you have to give me some type of feedback and rationale before I provide this funding to you, because I've got to be a good steward of the money that I've got. So I can definitely empathize with what you were saying there, with the students having difficulties getting information. But looking at some of these things from how public service organizations, I've been teaching a series of applied ethics courses in computer science, engineering, and taken a couple in the accounting profession as well. And it seems like the big thing that we always come back to is the tone at the top, and how do we create and influence leaders and the leadership of these organizations to do all these wonderful things that we're talking about. And it's and I think it's an important thing to begin to infuse this at the bottom, as students then become practitioners and they move into their organizations, that they've got these expectations, but then also to have this approach of concurrent or recurring training in these ideas and concepts, so they're not lost as people get involved in all of the day-to-day activities that distract them from these things and do create artificial sense of urgency and all of these other things that we've just discussed. It's this and it's this idea of maintaining an emphasis on the longer term. What are the externalities going to be of the actions that we take, and how we provide our services, or who we include and who we don't include in the meeting, because frequently that speaks louder than anything that's actually said in the meeting, is who's actually at the table. And so that I guess is just my kind of sense of things, is it's this really trying to impact the tone of leadership and what they look for. Because to go back and kind of quote what you said at the beginning, is the what's measured, or what's measured is what matters, right? And so it's kind of this, well, what does leadership expect? What do they demand from their organization, from their people? And that's kind of the way that we wind up with how ethical the organization actually is in practice, versus, you know, what type of ethical code they may have in place.
Okay, this is a really interesting conversation. Thank you. We do have a question in the chat from David Reed. We're going to get to that in just a moment. I'm given to understand that the first three people didn't see the first three questions, so just so everyone knows where we're at. These are the three questions we've asked so far. We have one more question to ask, and we'd like to open it up to audience Q&A. And here is the fourth question before we open it up. What are pedagogical strategies to teach these ethical principles, especially teaching how to fully inform and advise and to demonstrate integrity at personal, organizational, and professional levels? And I know that all the panelists have discussed this to a degree, but it'd be interesting if you have any further thoughts.
I'll jump in real quick and just say that when I was thinking about this question, I was thinking really like, how do I do it, right? So I talked a little bit about in one of my undergraduate classes how we kind of shared space and we had readings, and then we came together and we discussed them and we were in dialogue, and they were often about really challenging topics: power and privilege, intersectionality, thinking about all of these other dimensions, right? In other classes, I love teaching cases because teaching cases allow me to share kind of a real world scenario and then pick it apart at multiple levels, right? So individual decision making. Did they, if you were in this person's position, how would you have thought about this decision? How would you have kind of taken the information that you had available to you, processed it, and would you have done it better? Could you have done it better? And then, but also thinking about what are some of the kind of cultural dynamics that are shaping or informing that decision-making processes, or those decision-making processes. And then also giving them the opportunity to think, what are systemic or kind of structural changes that we might be able to take on, right? So for me, teaching cases, thinking about kind of how we can think about kind of ethics from a personal, organizational, and professional perspective, allow me to kind of interrogate multiple layers. And, I have a bunch that I've used, multimedia teaching cases to, all sorts of, the simulation cases and so on, to get students to think about these things. And typically, we've done some of the work around critical reflexivity before that. So then after we've talked about, all right, so you responded, you have this individual kind of organizational or kind of structural conversations. Now let's take a step back. How much of this is informed by how you came into the scenario and your lens for your initial investigation? If, having these conversations, would you think about this differently had, now that you've been thinking about all these other ways that people come to these spaces? And so to me, those are some of the kind of useful pedagogical strategies that I would offer up.
To continue off of that idea about the teaching cases, in my org theory class in previous semesters, I've used one long case study throughout the semester, and twice I used James Comey's A Higher Loyalty, because the whole premise of the book is he felt that it was his duty to fully advise and inform. And the book is flawed, of course, and students go into it with their own ideas from what they watched in the news and the interviews that he did, but the book is just his single perspective on it, and so of course he comes out looking great. But in the book he talks about the fully advising and informing, and that it was the professional and personal duty to do what he did. And so that throughout the semester, we read chapters in the book, and then we have a traditional textbook so we can draw parallels between the theories and what he actually did. But in teaching that, I haven't, broken the fourth wall or whatever and ask the students to consider their own perspective. So that would be a good way to expand the incorporation of that book. But I'm always looking for other quote unquote popular books to incorporate into the classroom. So I'm reading Bolton's book now in the room where it happened. So I'm thinking of how I could use that in a classroom setting, because I think that books like that tend to engage students in the theory a little bit more because they're seeing it on the news, and it brings up political discussions. And I have found it to be interesting from an instructor's perspective.
So I will continue talking about case studies, because I find that when I read this question, that was the first thing I thought about, was like the deep value that case studies bring to the classroom. And when I was first started out teaching about a decade ago, I did what I was taught in an ethics education. I was often taught to like go find my own case study and evaluate it, and then write a paper in class, or recall a time when I was working and something happened, and then write a paper about it. And what I realized when I was teaching is that, you know, students bring a variety of different backgrounds with them into the classroom. So some of them have not worked before. Some of them have worked in different countries and have a totally different cultural orientation. And so it was sort of a landmine from an instructor's perspective to try to make sure that everybody was at the same place and could, you know, keep up with the class requirements. And so I realized that case studies bring this really valuable, almost like a level playing field for everybody to have the same information to engage in some reflection, and then that presents an opportunity to have really robust conversations in the classroom. And so I've used a variety of different cases, both fictional and then ones from JPay or Park that have been, you know, like 10 pages or less of reading that the students have to do, but have a lot of great content in them too. And so I've also found that, you know, these case studies that are grounded in the real world are helpful, but we know from literature and the research on teaching and learning that fictional case studies are also really helpful, because they create a different environment that's not sort of grounded in reality, but that students can still latch onto, using different parts of their brain that cultivate the pro-social behaviors we want students to have and public servants to have, like empathy. And so one of the books that my students read this last semester was The Intuitionist, which is about a public servant who's a elevator inspector in an imaginative world. She works for the Department of Elevator Inspections, and she has to wrestle with confronting racism and gender-based discrimination and a variety of different things. And so we were able to talk about her experiences and the systems that were at play as well. And so my students, in my experience, it was really interesting to see how they could engage in discrimination in the fictionalized world, and how that helped them then carry it back into the real world. Whereas sometimes I think some students will engage in some of those tough conversations, but some other students might not. And so how do we create an inclusive environment for everybody to have the benefit of learning? And then the last thing that I want to add, and from a teaching perspective, is I spent a lot of time talking about and teaching the steps to engage in empathy in the classroom. And so I try really hard to help the students learn, how do I stop making sense of the world from my own perspective and try to make sense of the world from somebody else's perspective? And there's different techniques and tools that we can use to do that. But ultimately, it's about teaching students to be curious about other people's perspectives, and the desire to stay curious and to sort of stop your own internal thought process and really try to imagine, using your creative potential, what the world looks like from somebody else's perspective. And I think that is a skill that ultimately leads to greater, personal, organizational, institutional integrity.
Okay, and I guess I'll jump in here at the end, and to just kind of do blanket agreement with everybody's inputs about case studies. That I don't know how you could actually get around it. That literally to teach these principles and to get people to really get their arms around them. I think that's critical, to bring in the case studies, and that and there's one of the more interesting, and I'll just throw out there, I particularly like Savara and the ethics triangle that he uses in his ethics primer, because it gives 3 different approaches to of ethical theories, and what really seems to give students a difficult time. They like to judge. We're all kind of good at that, right? So you know, we've read a bunch of Kant, and we've got Rawls, and now we're going to go over here to Mill, and we're going to read some Aristotle, and we're going to get this whole thing. We've got it. And then when I say the ethics triangle, they're like, oh, good, I can triangulate and I can get the answer. And it's like, no, stop. Don't do that. If you do that, that's not going to score well. What I want you to do is identify in this case analysis, and I usually try to use actual cases like defunding organ transplants in Arizona, or some of these others that have that are, have a lot of documentation to them. Well, what are the different the different players' perspectives in this, the different parties? What, who is using more of a principled approach to this? Well, who's more of a consequentialist type person? Who's trying to get over here at the virtue intuition type of approach to this? And then just have them take on the role of, they are a staffer for an elected official that's going to have to vote on this, and they don't want, and the official doesn't want their opinion. They want to know what these other constituents are thinking, or what perspective they're taking, so they can address that as they go into the debate and the general discussion on that. And students really seem to, once they shift out of, well, here's who's right and why, and well, here's these other people's perspective, and it kind of forces them mentally to walk in the other's shoes. And I think I've had several of them come back and say, wow, I had never really thought about that until you forced me to identify with this other person. And then and I'm like, well, nobody forced you. We don't do that. That's not nice. But it's that idea that we kind of have to learn to have this empathy that we're trying to get across, but to use it in a way that we can perhaps help communicate to others on, well, here's what the decision is, and here's why we made it. Not necessarily that this is the best decision, kind of like that 5 days at Memorial. What a, because that one's a doozy. But it's like, oh my gosh, I'm literally on the horns of a dilemma here. What do we do? We've got gentrification, yet we want to be, in this whole planning thing. How do we zone this? What are we going to do? Type of thing. And I don't know. It can, because a lot of times the students' perspectives that they give back, I was like, wow, I had never really thought about it that way. What a cool way to think about it. So anyway, but I fully agree, the case study stuff and whatever framework that you can work in there to try to get students to actually empathize with, or at least understand points of view that they would not have even listened to before is pretty cool.
Can I add real quick?
Please.
As well? So one of the other things that I have kind of in some my other notes that I never ended up talking about was also active listening, right? So creating opportunities for students as an assignment to actively listen to other people. And not me, right? And not looking for an answer to a task or how they're going to, meet some criteria to pass, but actually practice active listening, because I think that active listening, and for me, I mean, in some ways is very much kind of informed by Camp Stivers and her work, and thinking about how, that sometimes we just need to be present and listen to other people, and hear what they're saying and ask them whether or not we are interpreting what they're saying accurately. And then, creating opportunities for that. And I recognize and understand that this can't happen in all moments and all times, much to Dr. Kline's point that, we also have to do work. But I think creating opportunities in the classroom for students to talk with one another, and then asking other people, asking them to share stories, and then kind of share back. This is what I heard you saying. And then giving them the opportunity to be able to say, no, that wasn't quite what I was saying, I think can be a pretty powerful space for students to practice that tool and that skill.
Okay, this is a fantastic discussion. Thank you. We actually already have 3 questions. We're going to open it up to audience Q&A. We're going to start with David Reed, then I'll ask a question on behalf of Don Rice, who asked me to do that, and we'll go with Lauren Edwards. So 1 second, let me just activate the microphone for David Reed. David, you should be off mute to ask your question.
Thanks. Can I be heard now?
Yeah, absolutely
Hello?
fine. Absolutely fine.
Thanks. Dr. Kline raised the issue of a need for greater expectations of transparency on nonprofits, and I agree. I was wondering if any of the panelists have thoughts on who is in a position to impose those greater expectations of transparency on nonprofits. And maybe the answer is different for nonprofits that rely on philanthropy versus nonprofits that rely on government funding.
Really interesting. Thank you.
Sure, I'll start the conversation. My first response would be donors, because that is where the money is coming from. And we're seeing now in the one part of our dual pandemic of trying to address racism, people are starting to ask questions about where the money is coming from and how some organizations are funded and how equitably they're serving their constituents. So the donors should ask, what is this organization's hiring practices? What does the executive level leadership look like? Does it represent the people that they're serving? So I would say that that's one part of it, the donors. And then the other part of it, Dr. McCaskill touched on earlier about United Way. And I think the larger organizations like the community chest model organizations, there's a certain level of isomorphism that happens in the sector, that if the large organizations do a certain amount of disclosure of their management practices, their organizational plans, their financial practices, that other organizations will have to align themselves and adopt those practices as well. So those would be my 2 ideas. Of course, there's still going to be organizations who just don't want to comply or don't want to be transparent, but I think that hopefully we're seeing a shift, given that people are more interested in how companies and nonprofit organizations are behaving and if they're contributing to systemic racism or not.
Okay. I wholeheartedly agree with Dr. Kline on that, because in the grant writing course that I taught this past summer, prior to the pandemic, it was things were very much shifting that way. Almost all the speakers that I brought in that are on foundations and these other donor type organizations or funders, they're wanting transparency. They're demanding it, and I think that's one of the things that I think it's almost going to be it'll be a harsh evolutionary outcome for those that decide to remain opaque in the way that they're trying to do their funding or the way that they structure themselves, because these donor organizations, particularly the ones that provide substantial amounts of grant money and things, are that's what they're requiring now, and I think that's actually quite healthy for the sector.
And any of other panelists who want to weigh in, that would be great.
Go ahead, Dr.
The only thing, what strikes me as interesting about this conversation is I can see the merits of wanting greater transparency for a certain group of nonprofit organizations or philanthropic organizations. But I live in a city, I live in Baltimore, and we have a disproportionate number of very small nonprofit organizations, often volunteer run, that serve very important communities in terms of leveling the social equity in Baltimore City. And so any requirements that are imposed on a certain group of organizations that rightly and morally and ethically should disclose more information about their practices may also trickle down to impact those organizations. So, a $50,000 a year organization that is run on all volunteers might genuinely not have the human capital to impose greater transparency burdens on. And so whatever solutions we look at, we have to make sure that we're not disproportionately impacting groups that are already at a disadvantaged position because of the nonprofit industrial complex. So we have to be very mindful about the solutions that we propose not having those unintended consequences. And that's where earlier in this conversation, when we were all talking about unintended consequences and having the right people in the room, so we have to get those multiple perspectives and really weigh out what our choices are. So are we just talking about organizations that are $1 million and more? Are we talking about, the mom and pop nonprofit that was accredited to get a city grant every year of $1,000? Like what type of nonprofit are we talking about? And so I think it's important to keep in mind the nonprofit sector is so diverse in that way. And that's an important part of the conversation too.
So that's exactly what I was going to say in terms of thinking about apparently just on the same page. So that the same thing in terms of like, asking people, what does transparency look like in your organization? Like, what is it that you can provide in a meaningful way, right? So I'm trying to be really thoughtful too in terms of how I assign projects in class, especially in this moment that ask students to go out and gather information from organizations, because they might just not have the capacity in this moment to help me in sharing that learning experience. And so I'm only going to the organizations personally that I know really well, right? That I know that they have the materials available, or asking the students to only draw on those relationships that they know that they can go to, that they're not drawing away from probably what is kind of the central focus of what an organization is doing right now. And that probably comes from my own work with hyper local grassroots organizations that really want to do and help my students learn, but just don't have the time or the resources to be able to do that in a meaningful and effective way. And then they come across as bad organizations. And so I'm trying, and so constantly asking them, like, what does transparency look like to you? And how can we make sure that our students understand that this is as transparent as you can be in this moment, in this given time, given context, right?
This was a fantastic discussion, and I think it nicely goes in line with this question that was asked by Don Rice. Don Rice asked me to ask this on their behalf. The question is here. So Dr. Kline and Dr. Dolamore talked about students and individuals using empathy and intent in the classroom. How can one use these tools as young adults if they have never used these tools before? How do you introduce and help students master these tools in graduate schools? Would you not agree even case studies assume there is some baseline understanding of intent to the conversations being had in the background?
Well, I'll take a stab at this one. I think I love this conversation. I love this question in particular, right? So, and there's several questions here. So I think I will tackle this idea about empathy first, because I've been teaching empathy for several years now. And when I first taught empathy, I did it like I do all of how I approach a lot of my classes, like, here's the topic and let's break it down and now let's practice it. And I realized that presumes a lot of things of where the student's at. And it also, I had several students every semester for the first couple of years when I was teaching that would tell me, like, I just don't have empathy. I am maxed out in my life. Like I do not practice empathy, and I'm okay with that. I try to be a nice person, but, and I was always surprised by that kind of response, but ultimately maybe understanding of that perspective. And what I realized is I was going about this the wrong way. And so, research says everyone has an empathic capacity. And so we also have the capacity to develop that skill. And so when I introduce empathy now, I present questions to students about, say, like, who is this person? Like, if we're using a case study, name the person and then say, what do you think they're thinking in this situation? And then really push them to keep thinking about that until they're no longer using their own, say, well, I would be thinking. It's like, no, what information do they have? How are they making sense of the world? What do you think their next thought's going to be? Or what were they thinking before this moment, to really help them practice that perspective? And so I think there's tools like that you can do to introduce empathy without saying, now we're going to talk about empathy, and empathy means these 3 things. And so I find it more effective to do that and then introduce the E word in, because then people are like, oh yeah, I was doing it in that situation. But talking about a case study and empathizing with somebody in practice is very different than, like, in the classroom setting, than when you're in the real world and when you're have all these compounding power dynamics and contexts that are at play. And so I think there's a lot more work that I need to keep doing to understand how really to support students through that process. And so I agree with the second part of this question, that yes, even case studies assume a certain base level understanding. And so, one of the elements of deaf culture that I have really learned to appreciate, because it challenged my traditional notions of what a conversation looks like in the classroom, is, the first question you ask is, like, essentially the equivalent of, like, is everyone ready? Is everyone ready to start the conversation? Are we all present? Have we taken care of everything else we need to do? Can I literally see everybody in the room? Can everyone see me? The equivalent of, like, can you hear me, in a hearing culture? But that, it really helps everybody to focus first. And it also creates an opportunity for the oftentimes in classroom now, the first things people say is, like, I'm ready, but I'm really confused about these things that were in the case study that I've never learned about before. So I used a case study in the spring that was about like harassment in the workplace. And I had a student that just said, like, I didn't know that was not allowed, that would just be pushed back upon, that I didn't know that there would even be rules that would say that's not allowed. And it was an opportunity for us to have a conversation about different cultural values and expectations of workplace in different countries, and what people have experienced. And so I think there's some of the values that I'm learning about the deaf community has really helped with, we're going to sort of take everything down, make sure everyone's ready, and then it just sort of reduces the fear students might have about bringing up, like, I'm confused about something. So rather than me jumping in, starting lecture, okay, we're going to talk about this case study today, it's like, are we all ready to start that process? And people are often like, well, no, I'm not ready because I don't understand everything. So I think there's some tools we have to employ and learn to employ to have that baseline ready.
Mm-hmm.
So go ahead, Dr. Kline.
Oh, no, go ahead. You were starting.
That's okay. So one of the things that I use in my class, similar to Dr. Dolamore, in an in-person, it would look like sitting in a circle and have everyone go around and say what they're bringing to class today. Recognizing, and I usually start with saying, we're all human, right? We're coming to class with all the things that make us human. I had a student tell me that I was the first faculty member that had ever recognized their humanity publicly, that I used the term that said that they were human, and that they went back to that. It was in my eval, and so I think there is something to modeling it as well and saying, look, we're all showing up to this place with stuff. Share what you're comfortable sharing. And I'll have students say, like, this was a really crappy day. I'm here on autopilot. And then we all just recognize that, right? We're not going to, like, constantly go after that person for not participating today because they had a crappy day. And there are other people that had the opportunity then to celebrate. And I think that it shows, and I don't know if it's practicing empathy in quite the same way, but it's recognizing that people come to a space as more than just student or faculty, learner, expert, fill in the bubble of whatever term we're using, that they have whole selves, and kind of creating spaces. And I know that those models have been adapted in other organizational structures, right? So in faculty meetings, or in community settings, organizers would use these tools often, right? Sit in a circle, talk about what everybody's bringing to the table in that moment, and then move on to the agenda, right? But recognizing the full humanity. And I think that's one of those ways of demonstrating without having to say, this is the definition of empathy that we're going to be using, and then scrutinizing whether or not you have it, but then, showing that we are full human selves.
To address the one of the questions earlier, and what Dr. Dolamore said, the one way that I think you can foster this in a traditional classroom is allowing silence. And I'm at a hearing institution, and silence can be awkward, and it's okay. But on Zoom classrooms, silence is, people assume that you lost your internet, or you'll get emails from students, what happened, I lost the feed. But I think that silence just allows them to process it while you are gathering your thoughts, because people on Zoom are just expecting everything to happen like boom, 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 boom. And I think in the classroom, we have a little bit more natural time to just, walk around the classroom, or do some of those, checking in type of behaviors. So I'm still thinking through, for the online classroom, how do we engage in an informal way where we can have some of those silences, or just informal conversations. I don't know, all the conversations are like, is your kid in sports, or are you trying a new recipe? And it's like, on Zoom, that doesn't necessarily always translate, but I still think we need to make room for those informal conversations to build a relationship with our students. To address the question though, how can one use these tools as young adults if they have never used those tools before? I would say that kids have empathy. I think that if you have ever talked to a 10-year-old and asked them about their friends at school, it shows that they have empathy. And as Dr. Dolamore said, it's a skill that we can develop. People have different skill levels. And then the last point that I wanted to say about the question about the case studies, another tool that I've used in the classroom is bringing in guest speakers, practitioners from the field. In the spring semester, before we went online, I had the executive director from the Chester County Maternal and Child Health Consortium come in, and she talked about all of the challenges that the organization was facing, and just the clients that they serve, the moms and the kids that they serve. And I think the students understood it in a way that they wouldn't have if they had read it in a case study, because she was in front of them, she was human, she had just come from work. You could feel that she had just worked a very long day. And so I think that guest speakers, especially now, because many of us are online, you have a limitless pool of guest speakers to select from. So those would be my ideas.
Well, and just to comment on the last part of the question about agree some studies, case studies assume there's a baseline understanding of intent to the conversation being had in the background. That was one of the things that we in a class over the summer. I had a student that was just absolutely stumped about this whole sexual harassment thing. And he was looking for bright lines on he needed yes, no. There was no gray area for him. And it's interesting that there are students out there that are like that. And how do you bring in that, hey, there's gray areas. There's, this person might be comfortable with this type of behavior, but this person is not. And you need to understand that there's different personal boundaries in different circumstances, and there isn't a bright line that I can tell you you can go right up to here and you have to stop, or that type of thing. That's a real challenge in in the pedagogy is as far as if students have always had bright lines or, you know, really hard edges that they've always encountered, that they don't understand this gray area stuff. It bothers them. It's much like the silence you were mentioning. It's the, what do I do in this void? I don't have, you know, I don't have a solid anchor here. What do I do? And it's like, well, that's where this whole critical thinking kind of comes in. This, what we're trying to get you to do. So it's, yeah, it's, and it's uncomfortable even because when he was asking me this stuff, I'm like, oh, geez, really? We're going to go here? Okay. And so I'm like, I don't know, that's 22 years of Marine Corps stuff going, no, I'll give you a bright line. You want a bright line? Here's a bright line, pal. But it's you know, I've got to stop and just go, no, this is serious. This is, you know, something that everybody needs to be a little uncomfortable about. If we're not, then we're not paying attention. So.
This was a fantastic discussion, and I think it really nicely goes into what Dr. Lauren Edwards asked. So Dr. Edwards, you are off mute, so if you'd like to ask your question.
Awesome. I so appreciate what Dr. McCaskill was saying about bright lines, because it really does go into my question real well. One thing I've been thinking about is the paternalism, sometimes I call it the tyranny of evidence-based policy. And then realizing we're using that to grade our students as well. And through really complicated rubrics, we're giving them evidence on why they made the grade they did. And at the end of the day, I think sometimes we're creating a lot of work for ourselves and sending out administrators, future administrators, that are still looking for bright lines and achievement. And we haven't changed that up for them in the classroom, because the classroom is the place where we teach these bright lines of achievement. So we've done this really great job of getting rid of the sage on the stage, or most of us have. We've really thought about other parts of the classroom. I'm beginning to think it's time to dig deeper. So I've been looking at contract grading, collaborative syllabus planning, those types of tools. Are there anything y'all are doing in your class to really challenge that status quo of the professor knows everything, including pedagogy, which we're never taught, and building a more collaborative classroom to create more empathetic and collaborative administrators? Thank y'all.
Fantastic question. Thank you.
I've practiced. I like to just try new things, which means that I'm constantly trying new things. So I've tried a couple different things. I'm going into this semester, and I asked my students, this is what I've done in the past. Like, I'd really love your insights. Like, what do you want to do in this class in the coming semester? And I found that students are actually really reluctant at this moment, because the feedback I've gotten is that I'm in decision overload, right? Like, they're having a really hard time processing the constant deluge of information. So I've tried to, in many ways, be transparent, say, okay, so I kind of put it out there to you, didn't get a lot of feedback. The feedback I got was really, I have too many decisions to make. I don't want to make the decision about what's in the class. So this is what I put together based on all of my experience and other people's insights from previous classes. But throughout the class, we're gonna, verify that we're on track. And then I always create opportunities to do course corrections. And my students will tell you sometimes, maybe it's a little too late, maybe I do it too early, whatever. But I'll usually, in a few weeks in, depending on the class, we'll stop and say, all right, where are we at? Like, what do we need to change? How do we do that? The biggest thing that I've struggled with, to Dr. Edwards' point, is that our online program is a fully online, asynchronous master course product that's built years in advance. So usually 18 months to 2 years in advance. And so changing that is probably the bane of my existence. And I really struggle with that approach to this kind of the master course. And number one, it's called a master course, so that's a whole nother thing, but the master course model. And so I tend to do it in the classes that I have the flexibility. I kind of try new things all the time and sometimes fail and then tell students that I failed and like, let's figure it out together. Sometimes it's super successful and then we celebrate. But I'll be completely transparent that I struggle mightily in our MPA program, which is a master course model, and I can only tinker around the edges. And oftentimes I'm not even teaching a class that I built. So.
I was going to say, similar to what Dr. Edwards said with the collaborative syllabus, I use collaborative rubrics. So I'll just put a blank rubric on the screen, you know, if I'm in a traditional classroom, or I haven't done it yet on Zoom, but you could theoretically do it, and ask students, all right, this was the assignment, what am I looking for? And by the mid to the end of the semester, they'll say, oh, APA, so we'll put APA in there. And then other things like, oh, answer all parts of the question, it has to be professionally written. So they know at a certain point in the classroom what a graduate level product should be. So that's one way of just opening the conversation that they are part of the process. But it's, you know, it's an imperfect strategy because there is still certain things that I'm looking for in terms of the assignment. But then also to Dr. Edwards' questions, we're products of a larger paternalistic system. As I said before, for those of us who are pre-tenure, teaching evaluations are still very important. And for those of us that are NASPA accredited, that NASPA accreditation is still very, very important. So I think for us to totally eschew formal assessment tools would be a privileged position to be in. So that's all I'm going to say.
That was a very polite way to say that. That was, I must say that was, because I did have a misspent 3 years as director of assessment here. That was kind of a, so it's strange to even be talking about that. But yeah, the trying to balance the need for flexibility and to get students to kind of think on their own and set their boundaries and take their goals and objectives into account, other than just trying to get across the finish line and not really, you know, just not have them not worry about the so much about the end state as the trip that they're taking to get there, because that's usually where you find the most interesting things. I mean, you know, you could even find out that this destination you were so headstrong, you know, bent to get to, isn't the place you wanted to go at all. There was something much more interesting on the way there. So that's that really is a challenge, and balancing that with now, how do you assess that, and how do you gather evidence that this learning actually occurred and that this skill transfer took place, and all of those things. Yeah, that's a particularly challenging issue. I would agree, and would be quite the luxury to be in that lovely. I guess what is that? You get that when you're chaired, or is that when you're in the even the after stages of that? I'm not sure. But.
I want to echo sort of what a lot of my fellow panelists have shared about, you know, how great this question is that Dr. Edwards shared and asked of us. I think, you know, my initial response to it is that, to Dr. Kline's point of, we're operating in a system that's sort of greater than our individual classroom or any individual assignment that we might have control over. And so my initial response is that we will never be able to do that, given to create ultimately an idealized, you know, collaborative system in our classroom, as long as we're constrained by ideas of like accreditation and credit, even like the idea of like a credit hour and how many credit hours and how many semesters we need to complete a certain degree. All of those things are predicated upon certain notions of how things have to be done. And so as long as we have to operate within that structure, there's only so much that we can do to create collaboration that doesn't, as to Dr. Nichols' point, put like a burden on the students that we're serving in the first place, right? So like creating collaboration should not create more stress for somebody who's already, especially in 2020, where we're going through a very heightened and very stressful time. It also shouldn't put more burden on faculty to sort of figure this out. I think that, being untenured or being a woman or being a person of color, we might already have a lot of other burdens imposed upon us. And so ultimately, I agree that this needs to happen, that we sort of need to rethink about what is the system that we're operating in and what are we complicit with by participating in this system. And so I think ultimately the people who need to create change are those with greater power. And so, I think we should strive to do certain things in our classroom. I think, Dr. Edwards, I think it's great to have like a collaborative syllabus if that works in the classroom, or my students eventually can get behind this idea of ungrading or contract grading, with some amount of hesitation. But I think beyond that, it's very difficult to achieve this without the change that we need that goes much deeper than any one classroom or even any one program. What do we need to fully reevaluate in the higher education space would be sort of my thinking about this question.
And I'll add too that, so I have the luxury of now being tenured. Well, in a couple days, I'll officially be tenured. I also am really transparent with my students about why I make the decisions I make. Like that sometimes there are things outside of my control. I've been asked to do this and this is why I'm doing it. And then I'll give them all of the evidence and provide it to them. And we'll have conversations, right? So even on, to the point of, student evaluations, and we're talking about gender and racial bias, I'll give them information that says, I really appreciate your feedback. Be thoughtful about how you're giving feedback. Would you give that same feedback to my white male colleagues? And just asking them, posing that question, giving them all of the, links to analyses that, student evaluations tend to be biased. And so I'll do the same thing, and maybe it's my own little personal subversive way of saying that there are things that I'd like to do and some things that I'm bound by these other structures. And so, you can be informed that this is what's in my control, and so we can share what's in my control, or I'll share ideas and get them to both understand that their insights are valuable and helpful, but there's all sorts of other things packed up in there. And
I think that we all have identified the topic of the next DSJ webinar series, because this seems to be a hot button topic. So just
Well, it's interesting that you note that, because actually our next series is actually going to be on teaching. So we're going to be collaborating with the section on public administration education. Thank you to Dr. Dolamore for everything we've been doing there. Students and new professional section, as well as the ASPA student representative Abdul Samad, to really offer what does teaching democracy and social justice look like? What does it entail? We actually have at least 6 webinars. We're going to be planning on that. So we hope to get that going based upon this. And I think we really do, especially after these wonderful questions and comments. With that, this is a wrap. I'd like to thank everyone for a wonderful webinar. Thank you to our panelists, Dr. Dolamore, Dr. Kline, Dr. McCaskill, Dr. Nichols. Thank you to our wonderful engaged audience. Please keep an eye out for the recording, which we're going to review with our panelists before releasing. Also, if you're not a member of the section but would like to be put on our email list, go ahead and write to us at the email that we just provided there. Sent you a bookmark to DSJ's YouTube page. So I hope you consider also submitting your section to our Sections 2 journal series at AT&P and Public Integrity. Provided you the links right there. Empathy came up a lot, ethics came up a lot, equity came up a lot, engagement came up a lot. That's actually the subject of our Public Integrity Symposium. And I think we'll just end here. Let's just remember that it's our duty to foster equitable, just, and ethical services for all. dismantle racism and white supremacy and patriarchy of public service institutions, and to understand, counter, and dismantle all of these behaviors at all levels and build new systems that lead to equity, justice, and ethics for all. So thank you for attending today. We hope you attend our future webinars, and have a great day and stay safe, everyone.